Welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking mock scrapes and how you can utilize them as part of your hunting strategy. All right, welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening as always. So this is the first recording here in the new studio. You know what? I kind of can already kind of hear it in the room a little bit. There is a little bit of an echo yet as part of the room layout. So I do still apparently have some work to do in regards to doing some sound dampening and sound absorption to eliminate some of this echo. So hopefully it's not too distracting for you. But yeah, I'm excited that I'm back in, or I guess essentially in the new studio or new recording area for the very first time, recording my first podcast in here. So excited about that. It's a little tonight, or this recording may be a little rough. It is actually 4 a.m. right now. I've been up since essentially 1 a.m. or 1:30 a.m. I guess I should say, and been trying to get some things set up, staying up essentially for the night to prep myself for working the upcoming night here, going back on night shift. So hopefully I don't get too lost and start rambling too much. But really I wanted to get into this episode or talk about this topic because, it's mid-July right now, and, this is really the time where I really start ramping up my process for the upcoming deer season. This is when I primarily start getting a lot of my cameras out, because basically, July timeframe is when you start seeing a lot of antler growth from a lot of bucks. And, basically doing that last bit of prep work or planning in regards to my fall food plot, process essentially, or planting. Essentially I had done my typical summer or spring or summer planning, and it didn't work out so well. So I did try the new process with the roller crimper. It worked pretty good in regards to some of the plant species, but didn't get all of the different plant varieties that were part of the mix I had planted from the fall. And basically due to the lack of rain that we received, it didn't do all that well in regards to the planting of those new crops. So the summer food plot, summer cover crop didn't turn out as well as I hoped. But again, it's kind of a work in process with that new roller crimper and how that would work out. So basically looking at in the next few weeks, planting the fall, really the main fall food plot. That's going to be the main draw for the property. Now there is some corn planted up on the top field that some farmers have planted. I don't know how good that's going to come in. So, it's going to change the dynamics of the property a little bit. So we'll just have to see what happens over the next few months as to how the deer kind of change their pattern up a little bit. And then hopefully that fall food plot does a lot better than the summer food plot did. Over the past few years, I've incorporated doing scrapes or creating mock scrapes or focusing on scrapes a lot more, both on the private ground that I hunt, as well as focusing on scrapes more so on public land as well. So essentially, if you don't already know, a mock scrape is essentially a manufactured scrape that's not already there naturally, to basically to get that same benefit that a typical scrape would have. Now, a scrape is essentially the communication hub for deer. Essentially, there's two components to it. It involves essentially a dirt patch. Can be varied in size, usually somewhere between 2 feet to up to 4 feet or even 5 feet in diameter. And what has the more important aspect, what I think, is some form of overhead branch that would be essentially at head level for deer. Quite often it's called a licking branch, and that's where I think more of the communication or scent deposits are really happening. So the scents that are being left in a scrape, again, most people know that it's a deer will pee in the scrape, or a buck will stand in the scrape. and pee on itself and basically allow that urine to run down its dorsal gland down into the scrape, leaving a deposit of scent. Doe will also pee in the scrape, especially when she's in estrus. So essentially that, any doe that is in estrus and is ready to breed, they'll pee in that, essentially kind of communicating that they're ready to be bred. And then for the overhead branch, again, that's where I think a lot more of the communication happens. Throughout the summertime, you'll have quite often a lot of does and even fawns that will, basically, put their faces on or nudging or messing with that overhead branch or that licking branch. And, they're depositing a lot of scent in that regard as well. And actually, I forgot, another important aspect to the ground component, that a deer will leave their interdigital scent, or basically it's that little gland that's in between their hooves. Any deer that walks through there will be depositing a little bit of that scent. And especially those bucks, as they're pawing at the ground or scraping at it, they're going to leave an additional scent from that as well. Again, that will probably, be more so during the pre-rut and rut phase. Typically during the summertime, I don't see very many bucks, pawing on the ground or, really being aggressive with those scrapes, at least this time of year anyways. The other scent that's left on that overhead branch is, basically different types of glands, and they'll kind of play more of a role throughout the course of the year. So again, those does and fawns, their preorbital gland is a little gland that's in essentially the corners of their eyes. That excretes scent as well. So anytime they're rubbing their face on it, or allowing it to rub on their eyes or over their eyes essentially, then they're also leaving a scent deposit. And then the other big one during the course of the rut is the forehead gland. So it's essentially it's a little gland inside the forehead that will excrete like a oily or almost like a waxy secretion, and that's going to have a significant scent profile. You're going to see, especially in regards to the more mature bucks, they're going to have, that forehead gland is going to be the most active for them. So during that pre-rut and rut phase, especially on those overhead licking branches, they're going to be depositing the most amount of scent, essentially signaling that they're a mature buck and that they're essentially ready to breed essentially. So in a lot of those scents too, if we can I'll be getting into that a little bit more in depth a little bit later, how you can utilize some of those different scent profiles to, if you really want to make that my scrape, seem more natural, or really, create a scenario. So in some of the big benefits of, a scrape or a mock scrape especially, is that it can become a focal point of an area. So, having that scrape, the natural scrape or a mock scrape in a location is going to draw some more deer into the area, or at least up to that location, being kind of that, that communication hub, or kind of like that, the water cooler of the woods, where it's just going to be an area where deer are going to come to communicate. And as a result of that, you can utilize that as a better way to collect inventory of the deer in the area, kind of creating that congregation of deer movement. You can certainly put a trail camera on that, on that location, and be able to monitor that and see the type of activity. And again, it's going to be more of a focal point where you can, kind of get a better idea of the deer in the area outside of just putting a camera out and seeing what passes by. So another one is by having that scrape, or especially having a scrape established, you're going to get an increased number of bucks that are going to visit that site during the course of the rut. Essentially, the buck activity will start to increase from about mid-October, through the course of the rut until it starts tapering off. You may even see them revisit those scrapes if you're hunting still and you're into that secondary rut. And then another really crucial part, especially in regards to when you're hunting, or especially when you're bow hunting, is that scrape will actually create a bit of a distraction. So, whatever deer you're going after will be distracted or preoccupied, within that scrape or utilizing that scrape, and allows you to be able to, get a better chance to be able to get, drawn on the deer while they're distracted or not paying attention. And also, it's going to hold them in a location to where you can execute a shot without having to necessarily, stop the deer. And you can even position it, uh, to where that deer stops and stands in that scrape, perpendicular to you, or maybe even quartering away a little bit. So you get a nice, you can really focus on your shot placement, or, position the deer for a good shot placement. So one thing I will say too, a scrape, or putting in my scrape, or hunting over a scrape is not necessarily an end all be all. Just because you're over a scrape or you build a my scrape, is not one of those scenarios where, if you build it, they will come type of deal. You do have to pay attention to the location. If you're putting a my scrape that's not in a good location where the deer aren't naturally kind of gravitating towards anyways, you may have a harder chance, or have a harder time being able to get deer to utilize that scrape, or really be even, or utilize it even at all. So you do have to be conscious of your location. Really, I kind of focus on putting scrapes in an area where I already kind of assume that there's an increased deer activity anyways, and then from there I can utilize it to fine tune that, that movement within that area a little bit more. So essentially what I'd like to do is I'm just going to go over every basically, setup of scrape that I'm currently running right now, and basically how I utilize them in different areas and the different techniques to try to build that scrape out. So the main areas that I'm focusing on in regards to scrapes or my scrapes is either travel corridors, staging areas, or directly on a food source. So some of the equipment that you're going to want to have, depending on how you'd like to actually build the scrape, is some type of tool to be able to rake out the scrape a little bit easier. Now certainly I've built ones where I'm just kind of kicking around my boot and scuffing up the dirt just with my boots there. Depending on how tough the soil is or how much vegetation you're dealing with, that can be a tough process. You're really going to work at it. So if you bring some type of hand rake or even rakes along with you, especially if you're on a private piece of ground where it's a little bit easier to haul in tools, that certainly is an easier way to be able to open up that fresh earth and get that vegetation cleared out. Another thing I always have is try to have some 550 cord or parachute cord with me. You can use that to basically, install a licking branch that may not be within reach of a deer, or you can even, kind of tie down some of the branches to where they're down where they can be reached by the deer, or even you can lash in a branch that not on a tree at all and tie a branch in. That way you have one within range for the deer. And then you can get really crazy if you want to in regards to adding scent to a scrape. Now I've kind of done the whole gamut where I've, taken some, pre-orbital scent. I've taken, dorsal scent, buck urine, doe urine, and kind of built the whole scenario where, taking some of that preorbital scent, putting it up on the licking branch, and then that dorsal scent, as well as the buck urine and doe urine, putting it down in the dirt and kind of creating that scenario. I've also taken, using some of those temperature regulated automatic drippers. So Tings and some other companies have kind of those overhead drippers where you pour the scent or the urine in, and then as it heats up, it expands. As it cools, it contracts, and then it releases that scent primarily during the daytime, where you have a fresh scent. And scent dripper, essentially putting scent out during the course of the day. Now, I've had some success with those, but they seem to be a lot more work. I ran into it where, you filled it up uh, with scent, and then, by the next day, it had already ran all the scent through it. So it's a little inconsistent, or can be inconsistent at the dispersal of the scent. So I found that usually they're more work than what the benefit is from them, really. So another thing that I do quite often, especially during the course of the season. So if it's already within deer season, if we're already into pre-rut or rut phase, and I want to get a jump start on that scrape to try to kind of draw some more attention to it, I use uh, essentially one of the main scents that I use for as a cover scent or attractant is Conquest scent. I utilize their Evercalm quite a bit as a cover scent. That works really good as well to essentially kind of get a deer smell around the scrape right out the get go. So what I typically do is I'll put some of that right into the dirt and the ground level of the scrape. And then I've even gone so far as even putting some of it on the licking branch itself. Now, putting it on the licking branch, I think is not really a necessary thing to do. And sometimes I wonder if that's a detriment because it is a waxy substance that gets left on those branches. And then sometimes I do see there's still some residue left, even though most of the scent's gone, that wax is still there. But I haven't noticed it to be a detriment or cause any issues of deer movement or seeing a negative impact in regards to the deer movement or utilizing that scrape because of it. And then the other thing I'll do with that, especially again during the rut, is take some dominant buck scent, put some fresh buck scent in there. Typically what I found is that if I put the Evercalm in there by itself, then a lot of times I start seeing a lot of, does be the first ones to show up to that scrape. But by adding that buck scent, especially during the rut, I mean, I've certainly had instances where a buck will visit that scrape that very night, checking it out, and basically, laying in his scent to cover up the scent of whatever I left. I've also done where it's basically just open up a patch of dirt and lay out set up my overhead branch for my licking branch and didn't add any scent at all. Now that's really good tactic to use if you're especially this time of year, or you've at least a month out of before season, where it gives the deer time to find that scrape and to be able to start adding their own natural scent to it. Because really, once scrapes get established, you really don't necessarily need to freshen up. Now you could, especially during a rut when there's a lot of deer movement, add some additional scent to it to kind of pique the interest for the area while you're in the stand. And then, of course, I've done the other thing where I've set up the scrape. I didn't have any scent, but I need to go to the bathroom, so I've physically peed in the scrape itself. Again, I don't know if that's really a benefit. Certainly haven't noticed any detriment by doing that, but it does seem to kind of have some of the same effect where just a urine smell in the scrape itself, for one reason or another, kind of draws some attention to it. So, certainly not something that something that you would necessarily need to do, but if you did have to go to the bathroom, you could throw some urine scent in there, just to maybe jumpstart it just a little bit. So let's get into some of my scrape setups and how I utilize them and how I go about, or a strategy around each one of them. So the first one that I've got is, or one of the ones I'm kind of most interested in currently, is on the private piece I hunt. Essentially this one is right in a travel corridor. Basically it's at the edge of some very thick, deep cover where a lot of the deer are either bedding or feel very comfortable moving around in that thicker cover, and it's on the edge between that thick cover and a patch of mature maples. that's, basically got a big canopy, but just more or less open hardwoods. And then, not far from there is the open field of the main, I guess the big main field of the property, where it's basically like 50 acres of open field. And again, there is some corn planted in there currently. So I imagine there's going to be some draw or movement of deer moving, from the cover to the corn. So essentially what this is a basic kind of like a Y shape of a couple different trails, where there's two trails coming out of the cover, and the unit, come to one, or, basically come to an intersection of one trail. And I've basically put this scrape right at that intersection where basically the three, points of that trail all meet together. So, and with this, with this intersection of these trails, is next to a smaller maple that doesn't necessarily have, or didn't have any good branches within reach of the deer. So what I did was took a freshly cut branch and essentially tied it with some 550 cord to the trunk of the tree. Again, hanging it essentially, somewhere between, 4 to 4.5 feet high. Basically you're just kind of looking at, whether or not the deer can reach it or not. Essentially somewhere around head level for them. So tied that branch up, basically having the end of that branch overhanging the dirt spot that I cut out or dug up a little bit. This one, because of it being in a thicker cover, I did feel more comfortable with increasing the size of that scrape. Basically, as the deer are walking, they will notice, that this is a big open area of just freshly turned dirt. And again, with this scrape being right in the middle of the trail, any deer that is utilizing those trails either has to, directly walk into the dirt patch of the scrape itself, or they're going to have to either, move their head around or basically avoid the licking branch if they want to go through it without leaving any scent. But more often than not, there's just something about having that branch right at head level where they almost can't help themselves. They're going to play around with that branch, rub their faces in it, and check the scent that from any deer that had already used it. And again, with this spot too, in regards to the location, I actually do have a bow stand that is within 25 yards of that scrape. Again, utilizing the location of being just a naturally good movement area for the deer, and then by having that scrape there, having that additional draw, and having that something that the deer will focus on, they'll potentially stop in that location and present a good shot. So the next one, again, is going to be in a travel corridor. It's essentially on the other side of the property, still basically in one corner of the big field. Essentially what this is basically an inside corner. So where the corner of the field is, it's right on that corner. So deer will, naturally, follow that inside corner. And this is actually, there's a little bit of a slope down from the main field. So the deer can actually walk through there without actually being at the level of the field itself. So they can kind of skirt around the edge of the field and feel really secure being down in the cover and at a lower elevation. So again, another one where I've set up my deer stand, on the field edge, and I can actually shoot into that inside corner, inside the cover. And that's where I set up the scrape as well. Again, same thing, kind of where that trail is already there naturally. That's where I built that in. Again, same thing. I didn't have a good overhead licking branch. So essentially what I did was I ran a strand of 550 cord between two trees essentially, and then hung a piece of grapevine down from that rope down into overhead the scrape. Again, same thing. That grapevine is probably somewhere between 3/4 of an inch to an inch thick. So it has some little bit of weight to it. It's going to give those deer a little bit of resistance. And I wanted to make sure that it was a free floating and not tied up real tight. Whereas basically just going to give them too much resistance. It's not going to move around as they try to bop it around or, hit it with their faces, or as a buck, moving around with their antlers. It needs to be free flowing a little bit, to kind of give it a little bit more, realistic action. And then again with this one too, I think I started this one out with some of that Conquest scent. This is one I did put some of the Evercalm on the branch itself. Again, the big thing I noticed was that the does and fawns utilized it first, and then as it got into the pre-rut and rut, that's when the bucks really started to become active, and they were hitting it basically early morning, and then in the evening, and then especially during the nighttime, as they were cruising at night, I would get a lot of pictures of them at night as well. Again, same thing, put a camera on it to be able to take inventory and document that movement. And then also, again, still having it within a bull range during hunting season itself. So on this third one, again, it's still on the private piece, but this is more so within a transition area or a staging area. So this is more on the back side of the property, near my main food plot. So essentially what I've got is the main food plot. There's a patch of pines, and then there's a little bit of an opening where there's some early successional growth, some pine saplings, or some other brush, and some small willows, saplings essentially coming up. So there's a nice little spot here, and then behind that is the main creek bottom where a creek runs through, and that's where a lot of the thicker cover is again. So basically that transition area where the deer can come out of that thicker cover, get into this little opening where there's some forage and different things to eat on, and then they can transition into the bigger food plot from there. In this area, I've had a lot of those saplings and some of that smaller brush. It's kind of a congregation of a bunch of rubs. Even there's a smaller crabapple tree that's essentially grown up a little bit now, but that's another area where I documented where some of the bucks would leave some kind of impromptu scrapes in the past. So this one here is basically, again, I was trying to find the best trail that I could essentially put it in, or put that scrape right in the middle of the trail. So I did find one that was on one trail, but pretty close to where a couple trails intersected. So from this, there's a couple of big mature pines. So what I did was I trimmed back a lot of the branches, essentially making it to where this licking branch I was gonna install kind of was the only branch in the neighborhood. And then by having all these other branches trimmed up and having this one hanging down and kind of out in the open, it's basically kind of sticking out like a sore thumb a little bit. So visually, from a distance, deer might be able to see that, and kind of pique its interest. It might come over. Again, it's kind of that same thing where deer just kind of can't resist hitting those scrapes when they see them. Same thing again, I opened up this scrape. I opened this one up again, probably pretty big, so I wanted to kind of draw attention to it. So once the deer got close, they would notice this big, bare, dirt spot in comparison to a lot of the area where it's kind of litter with some of the pine litter, and then a lot of the grasses and other weeds that are growing up around the area. So this one again, I anticipate I'm gonna get quite a bit more, either early morning or just pre-dark pictures. With this being that staging area, these deer are going to feel comfortable, being in that area, and kind of milling around in this area before they move out to the food plot that's a little bit larger. They're going to feel nice, safe, and secure. They're not going to be on edge like they would be, in the bigger fields where they feel more exposed. Same thing with this one. Again, hung a camera, and then also within shooting distance of a stand, where basically I've been trying to figure out how to get a stand location within the staging area. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm going to be setting up my tree stand very close to the pond and the main 2-track that kind of runs through the property itself, so I can utilize the pond as kind of like backstop that will prevent deer or not allow deer to get behind me or get downwind of me. And then I can also utilize the 2-track to sneak in there kind of quietly without, making a bunch of noise, tromping through the woods itself. So again, same thing with this one. We're looking at, again, I think it's about 25, 26, maybe 30 yards from the tree that I'm planning on hanging the stand to where that scrape is. And as you already can tell, there's starting to be a trend where I always want to have those scrapes within shooting range of a deer stand, especially in regards to when I'm bow hunting. So the next one I want to talk about is actually on state land or on public land, essentially. So this one again is a staging area. This area caught my eye a couple years back when I was doing some scouting, and there was just a array of rubs, and eventually found a couple of smaller, again, probably more impromptu or hasty scrapes that some bucks had made in that area. And I could see too from the rubs, there was definitely historical movement there. So there's definitely rubs that are much older, and then there were rubs that were essentially brand new from that season. So with this one, I utilized more so the natural scrapes that were already there. All I did was kind of upgrade them a little bit, or kind of freshen them up essentially. So with the scrapes that were there, they were probably somewhere between a foot to 2 feet in diameter, at least in regards to the bare dirt that was exposed. What I did was I opened that up probably closer to about 3 foot opening, just to try to push back some of that weed growth and make that dirt or that freshly turned earth a little bit more prominent. And then again, with that scrape already being there, there was already naturally an overhead branch. This one again, with it being when I first really built it or came across it, was already within season. So I did take some of that rutting buck, put that down in the scrape itself, and then took some of the Evercalm and put that up on the licking branch to just try to get a higher scent profile that could hopefully get a deer's attention a little bit sooner than having them try to find it naturally and build up that scent organically, essentially. So, and again, with this one, I was actually very pleased. Again, within probably the first night or two, I had probably one of the biggest bucks I've seen on public land, come and hit the scrape. And then basically, even during the daytime, because of it being in that staging area, I had pictures of bucks, essentially midday. And this was even still within October. It wasn't even November yet. And they were still feeling comfortable moving around because of the cover that was still in the area and hitting that scrape on a routine basis. Again, same thing with this one. It was in an area that I planned to hunt. So I had a stand location. I think with this one is probably about 30 yards. Again, I could still shoot at that scrape. Especially in regards to on public land, you do have to get a little more creative or, think about a little bit more as exactly where your placement of the scrape or your stand location is going to be. Certainly, you do have some limitations where you're not able to, cut out shooting lanes or, make any significant disturbance to any of the trees. So in the next one I want to talk about is on a food source. Now this is, basically I got kind of two examples for the food sources. So for the first one, I'm going to stick to that same parcel where I was just talking about the other one in that kind of that hub or that staging area. Not far from there is a patch of white oaks. And I noticed that last year there was a significant amount of white oak acorns that were in the area, and there was definitely deer utilizing that. So essentially, kind of picked out a stand location, and this patch of white oaks, it wasn't too big, but it was big enough where deer could certainly millie around in there and either not present a good shot or be difficult for the trail camera to really get a good representation or catch all the deer movement. So again, with this one, I essentially, within that patch of oaks, there was a smaller one, just enough to where I was able to bend one of the branches down to create a licking branch open up a patch of dirt, again, basically in an opening where I was sitting from my tree stand, and created essentially a mock scrape for that. Again, with this one, I came across this location during the season, so I did freshen it up with some additional scent. Again, some of that running buck and some evercalm, both on the branch and on the ground as well. And again, with this one, especially with the white oak drop that we had, it was not very long where I had a significant amount of pictures and got some good documentation of bucks that were in the area and eating on the acorns, as well as immediately started to utilize that scrape as well. And again, with that too, that's part of that idea of being able to kind of dictate or kind of encourage deer to basically kind of stand in one location compared to another. Those deer were naturally there eating within the acorns. Now I could have just left it alone without building that scrape, but with adding that scrape, again, it kind of created a bit of a focal point or something for the deer to focus on, or to draw their attention to while they're in the area that was in my shooting lane. And again, be able to have that distraction or have something that preoccupies that deer to be able to draw on them and be able to position them to stand in a position I want them. And then the last one I'm really going to cover is a scrape that you put out on like on a field edge, or in your food plot essentially. So these ones are probably honestly some of my least favorite ones. I don't really, I guess I'd say I don't really, focus on them as being, a key element of the strategy. But it is something that I certainly take in consideration, depending on the location of where you're going to put that scrape. Certainly, having it within bow range or within range of whatever, if you're using firearm or whatnot, having it within range is not, certainly not going to hurt you at all. That's one thing I did focus on, is making sure that the scrape that was there was within bow range. But unfortunately, a lot of times the deer just wouldn't utilize it as I was hoping they would. They've already kind of preoccupied themselves with feeding it within the food plot, to where, the vast majority of the pictures I was getting, or the intel I was getting from the actual scrape itself, would be mostly at night. So a lot of times those deer were in the food plot after dark, and as they're feeding throughout the course of the night, that's when the majority of the bucks were visiting that scrape within the food source. Now, again, that could be partially because of the size of the food plot I have. I'm looking at about a 3-acre opening. Now, if you had a smaller kill plot or a food plot that was more positioned basically as like a staging area instead of a destination food source, like kind of like what I got, having that scrape within the food source, within that food plot, if you're looking at something like a half acre or a quarter acre, you're gonna probably see deer utilize that a lot more, just because of the size of the plot and kind of their focus within it. So that actually brings up a story that I'll tell you in just a second as well. So in regards to my setup, again, this is essentially a pine tree that's in the food plot. It was a larger pine tree. That was one that we didn't necessarily take out of the field, just because of the size of it. And it had some naturally overhanging branches. In years past, I noticed that around that tree, there would be multiple small, scrapes that were made, again, primarily probably at night. So what I ended up doing was essentially trimming back a lot of those other branches that were overhanging within a deer's reach, and basically focus it on one side of the tree. That's where I had my deer blind currently, and had that essentially be the focal point. So instead of having the potential for multiple scrapes around the tree, I created essentially one, central, or one focal, area on that tree. So all the deer, if they want to, utilize a scrape, that's the area that they have to use. So Again, kind of concentrate some of the scent distribution to one side of the tree, basically forcing the deer to utilize it in an area where I could again, be able to have a camera on it a little bit easier, as well as having it on the side of the tree that I'm currently sitting on. So if a deer did utilize that while I was hunting, it would be in a position where I could get a better shot. Now, another scenario or another situation that you could do or tactic that you could utilize is basically if you don't like if you're wanting to put a scrape on your food source or on the edge of your food source and you just don't have a good tree or a good area to be able to install just a branch or have a licking branch, you could take essentially like a smaller tree that you have cut down, or a tree that maybe fallen over or anything like that, and dig a hole with a post hole digger or something like that, and basically install your own tree where you wanted it to be. And then you could utilize either natural branches that were on that tree, or basically install an overhanging branch, or again a vine or something like that, some form of branch or something that hangs down as your licking branch, and then you could dig out or expose the soil from there. This was a technique that I haven't used before, but in regards to the previous location I was talking about with the staging area on the private piece I hunt, basically that was something I was considering that I was going to have to do because of the lack of larger or mature trees to be able to install that scrape from. So I was basically prepared with a post hole digger and everything like that to install a tree where I wanted it. It just so happened that this pair of mature pines were just well enough to where again it was still within bow range and an area where it was gonna still have some natural deer movement. Essentially, before I even installed the scrape, that it would kind of boost the likelihood of deer utilizing that scrape. But to get back to the story that I was going to tell you, again, with a smaller food plot, you I would anticipate, or I've seen where you have a lot more success with deer utilizing that scrape. So this is from a few years back. I was helping my cousin on his private piece. They were installing a new food plot. Basically, it was going to be I believe it's about a half acre uh, food plot that he was going to install essentially in a big, thick patch of pines that was just kind of an opening. It was kind of a bowl we were going to plant this in. And again, same thing. There was a few, mature pines that were just too big to really take out or to clear out. So as my cousin's going through, and I believe he was using a rototiller, kind of rototilling the ground, getting us a good soil or a good seed bed, I guess, built. I grabbed some of the branches from some of the trees that we were clearing out, took some 550 cord, hung a tree branch from one of the overhead branches, and at the time my cousin was kind of looking at me thinking like, what am I doing? Like, and it was basically it wasn't a very good branch I was utilizing. It was kind of small. It still had pine needles on it, but it was kind of the best I could find in the area. So hung that branch up, and at the time my cousin thought I was a little crazy, thinking that the deer weren't going to utilize it all that much, and he was pleasantly surprised that even the first few times of hunting, any deer that really came into that food plot were naturally drawn to that branch hanging down within the middle of the field, and would utilize that scrape. So again, that's a good example of if you have a smaller food plot, I've seen that they are more likely to utilize that scrape in that scenario. So, and then for all those situations, again, like I said, I put basically cameras on every one of them. And so in regards to your camera placement, I've had situations where, the camera was basically at eye level, and, essentially where a lot of the deer were able to see the camera. It's one of those things too. It all depends on what your thought process or how the deer seem to be reacting to that camera location, especially in regards to the flash or the camera going off. Some deer will notice the cameras and seem like it doesn't even bother them at all. Other deer will see the camera or see the flash or whatever, and they definitely seem like they're on edge, or their body language appears as though they don't really like it. So being, you know, having or thinking out your placement of your trail camera as well, I think is pretty important. Typically what I'm doing is always trying to put those cameras to where they're not necessarily in the path of travel. So either a deer is, working perpendicular to that camera, or if the main travel or pattern movement looks like it's walking, essentially away from the camera, or where the deer would have its back to the camera. That is something I'll focus on as well. I just don't like to have, a deer come down the trail facing the camera and looking right at the camera as it's walking. Another thing I do quite often is try to put that camera essentially at head level, or somewhere between that 5 to 6 foot range at least, and then angle it down towards where I'm wanting it to aim. Just getting it up above, kind of out of that sight line of deer, seems to be. I get a lot more deer actually looking at I get a lot less deer looking at that camera or noticing the camera going off. So again, it's I've seen deer where they pay no mind to the cameras, but then also seen deer that seem like they're kind of anxious about it or don't really like it. So just by thinking that out or thinking that through a little bit, uh, you know, decreases your risk of having a deer that may spook because of that camera, and may start avoid the area or avoiding the camera. So something to keep in mind with that. And then another thing that I kind of forgot about talking about is if you build a mock scrape and then next thing they're starting to fill in with either leaves or duff or something like that from trees falling down, or the stuff falling off the trees. It doesn't necessarily, and you don't see that dirt spot is staying open. It doesn't necessarily mean that deer aren't visiting it. So I did run a scrape essentially behind or underneath some cedars. Essentially I opened it up and checked the cameras a few weeks later, or basically I checked the scrape itself, and it was all filled in with fallen pieces of cedar tree. It was basically kind of filled in where it looked like where it hasn't been any activity, or that scrape hadn't been visited at all. Basically I didn't see any tracks. Everything was kind of filled in. It looked like it was essentially a dead scrape. Pulled the camera, brought the card home and checked the camera, and noticed that there was actually quite a bit of activity on that scrape. Just none of the deer were actually, basically, pawing at the ground or really doing anything with the dirt. They were all focused on that overhead branch or that licking branch. So I had several bugs come through. Yeah, they didn't paw at the ground at all. They came in, messed with the licking branch, and then moved on. So just because you're not seeing that ground opening up or a lot of tracks within the scrape, or if it looks like it's getting filled in with leaf litter and stuff like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that scrape is a dead scrape or there's not any activity there. So when that goes through, even through summertime, certainly those bucks, the ones that do visit during summertime when they're still in velvet and whatnot, they're not. I haven't really noticed them really pawing on the ground or really being real aggressive with the scrape. It's not until we get into that pre-rut and rut phase that they start becoming much more aggressive with them, and leaving a lot more scent. While they're still in velvet, you especially probably won't see too much of that ground getting dug up, or the aggressive paw marks in the dirt. And even during the rut and pre-rut, you may or may not see where the buck has been pawing at the ground, but they're probably more than likely still utilizing that licking branch overhead. So that's a lot of the different ways I utilize scrapes or mock scrapes. Again, kind of utilize them in different locations, as well as using different techniques to establish them or maintain them. There's really not necessarily a right way to do it. I would say the only really wrong way would be is if you're basically in a bad location. I've ran into where I thought that I had a spot where there's tons of deer movement, and this is going to be a dynamite spot. And, ultimately, maybe a deer or two would show up during the course of the season, utilize it. But basically I learned that, I just picked a bad spot. that there weren't really that many deer around anyway. So, that would be really the only big thing to do is, yeah, whether you're, or basically you picked the wrong location, maybe if you visit that scrape location too often, I could see that you could sour it a little bit by leaving too much human scent in the area. You may kind of deter some deer around away from it. So once you establish that scrape, I would recommend that you don't really visit too often, or check, actually physically check that scrape too often, unless of course, what I've done in the past, or what I typically do is, after a hunt, then I go check the scrape, see if there's any activity, see if there's any fresh prints there. I might then at that point freshen it up with some additional, doe urine, or, buck scent or something like that. Especially if I'm going to come back, hunt that, in the near future. And then the other big thing too is, there's probably not a stand location that I hunt that doesn't have some form of scrape within shooting range. So certainly if you picked a spot where you expect there's going to be a lot of deer movement or suspected deer movement, certainly wouldn't hurt to add a mock scrape in that same location. It's just going to kind of sweeten that deal for you a little bit, give those deer just another reason to be in the area. And again, at that point then too, you could utilize them and position the deer a certain way, or have them face a certain way, or approach from a certain way to give you a potentially better shot opportunity. And then, yeah, I mean, and honestly too, the next point really would be is that there's no wrong time to really start a mock scrape up. So, certainly I found more success, starting them, basically kind of from now. All right, let me go back. So, during the early spring and whatnot, that's typically not a time that I'll start a mock scrape. It's not until usually at least until everything's leaves out, when I start seeing a lot more activity around them. So anytime through early summer all the way up until the end of season is a good time to really start a mock scrape. Certainly anything outside of that too, it's never going to hurt you building a mock scrape. So the best time to do a mock scrape, I guess you would say, is anytime. So I think that about wraps up my rambling for the morning. So hopefully a lot of this made sense to you, and something that if it's something that you haven't utilized before, that, certainly consider it. Again, this is kind of a main staple of my hunting strategy, is to, utilize those scrapes and, have that as part of, again, kind of my main strategy. Like I said, there's not a stand location that I hunt that doesn't have some form of scrape incorporated to it. So yeah, so I think that's it. Again, if we're not too much further away from deer season, I mean, we're looking at 2 months away from really the first, season really opens up, that first antlerless season, as well as the Liberty hunt opens up in September. So, we're really not too far away. Again, it's going to be kind of food plot season coming up, or at least if you do a fall food plot. Hopefully the rain cooperates a little bit more in that regard. So this fall, so a lot more success stories in regards to doing food plots. Scouting is a big thing right now, doing a lot of your summer scouting, getting your tree stands ready, getting your, kind of your equipment kind of prepped up now. Because again, something that you don't really want to dilly-dally with or procrastinate too much on, because it's going to be, season before we know it. So, doing a lot of scouting, trimming lanes, getting tree stands hung, certainly double check a lot of your equipment, especially if stuff that's been left out, for the season. Make sure you have, fresh straps and everything like that. Basically kind of make sure that you have the equipment needed to go out and get your stuff ready for season. So yeah, so we're going to call it with that. So if you like this episode, hit that like button, subscribe to the show, share the show with your friends. And with that, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.